Today we're going to be talking about the Columbian Exchange. So taking a look at how Spain sort of started to dominate the Americas. Portugal was getting involved as well. But after the voyages of Christopher Columbus, 1492, and then his subsequent voyages, we see the exchange of goods on a global scale, especially goods coming from the Americas to the other parts of the world like Europe, Asia, and Africa. And then the opposite, items coming from the world being introduced into the Americas. So we're going to talk about that legacy a little bit here first. One of the things you have to understand is that this was propagated by a voluntary migration, but also forced migration of millions of people. It caused an exchange of items that influenced the lives and cultures throughout the world. Wealth from the Americas caused new business and trade practices that arose in Europe. One of the new practices was known in a big picture scale as the Columbian Exchange. It's the global transfer of foods, plants, and animals during the period of colonization. American items that were introduced to the world include things like tomatoes, squash, pineapples, tobacco, cocoa beans, which is the basis for chocolate, turkey. Some of the more important items on the list became corn and potatoes, as these foods started to really change the diets of people throughout Europe. Also, some of the major European and world items that are introduced to the Americas include horse, cattle, sheep, and pig, many of your domesticable species that were not available in the Americas, bananas, black-eyed peas, yams, and then your grains like wheat, rice, barley, and oats. Of course, disease was a major component in the introduction of the Columbian Exchange, mostly in the form of smallpox, but measles, influenza, typhus, typhoid fever, malaria, and diphtheria were also something that was spread to native peoples in the Americas. I would like to show you a quick graph, chart, map, however you want to refer to it, of some of the major items that came from the Americas into Europe and the rest of the world. And then, of course, things like disease and items that were sent into the Americas from other parts of the globe as well. So here you can see we talked about corn, potatoes, tomatoes coming over, cocoa beans, other forms of beans, peanuts, peppers, and a host of other items like tobacco, which became a really big crop that was sold into Europe during the colonization period. Over here, coming into the Americas, are a lot of things that just weren't simply there. Bananas, grains, honeybee, sugar cane, which became a really big part of Brazil's early history, and unfortunately the slave labor there on sugar plantations. Livestock such as cattle, sheep, pig, and horse, and then of course those diseases that we did talk about also played a major role there. We have also, with all of this trade going on, global trade, the rise of capitalism. Now, capitalism in a basic sense, it's an economic system. It's based on private ownership, and it's also based on the investment of resources such as money for the purpose of making a profit. Merchants at this time would invest in overseas trade and exploration, which earned them great wealth if the exploration and trade was successful. Now, the increase of economic activity in Europe really did lead to improvements in a nation's money supply. That can cause inflation, though. What happens is it occurs when people have more money to spend and thus demand more goods and services. When the supply of said items are lower than demand, then goods become scarce, and then goods become more valuable, which drives prices up. And then eventually this can reverse the process so that demand will decrease based on the higher prices, and then supply will eventually regulate. So capitalist economists like Adam Smith would say this is the natural way of the market. Others will argue that this can be influenced by government influence. So that's something that becomes sort of a debatable concept over the course of history. One of the ways that early groups were investing in things with capitalistic ideas are called joint stock companies. These serve much like modern day corporations where investors would buy shares of stock in a company. Many people would combine their wealth for a common purpose or cause. Primarily during the 1500s and 1600s, when colonization in the Americas became very popular, this was a common purpose for joint stock companies. What would happen here with a joint stock company is it would reduce the burden of loss that investors risked with overseas population. Because there were many investors trying to get involved in this, individual members paid only a fraction of the large cost of colonization. You got to think about having a ship, paying the crew. You've got to think about then, of course, protecting the land, farming the land. There's a lot that goes into this. If the colony failed, however, investors would only lose the small share that they put in. But if the colony prospered, they're going to get a percentage of the overall profit and income, and they can become very wealthy. So these joint stock companies or joint stock ventures were really like the early form of a stock market where people could invest in exploration and colonization and can become very wealthy. All of this for the bigger picture. What countries are trying to do is gain as much wealth as they possibly could get. And that's a theory known as mercantilism. Mercantilism is also an economic theory. It holds that a country's true power depends mainly on its wealth. European countries actually wanted to acquire as much gold as possible. That was really the goal of mercantilism. They sought to get gold in two ways. One was by establishing and exploiting colonies. And then two is establishing what's called a favorable balance of trade with their rival countries. With a favorable balance of trade, what the country is trying to do is sell more goods than it buys, or in other words, export more than it imports. So manufacturing, self-sufficiency, okay? These are concepts of a favorable balance of trade and concepts of a mercantilist economic style. Now, these type of policies eventually changed European societal values. Mercantilism, because people were working to make their country as wealthy as possible, contributed to a national identity, also known as nationalism, which later led into certain conflicts with rival countries. Also, you had the growth of towns, which were on the rise due to a wealthy merchant class that was gaining wealth from selling some of these goods through the manufacturing process. So these are some of the basic changes that occurred during the time period of the 15 and 1600s due to the Columbian Exchange.